Welcome to a very special episode of the podcast, our 4th anniversary celebration. I can't believe it's been 4 years of sharing interviews with experts, insights, historical perspectives, and hearing from listeners like yourself. Whether you've been with us from the start or you're just joining, thank you for being part of this journey. In today's episode, we're marking this milestone by reflecting on how far we've come, sharing some of the most impactful moments from this past year, and looking to what's next to the podcast in our community. We'll also dive into practical tips for managing fibromyalgia and other chronic pain conditions and answer some of your more frequently asked questions. If you prefer to watch the podcast, there's a link to the YouTube video in the show notes. In fact, the podcast has been moving more and more on YouTube to reach more people who might not be traditional podcast listeners, but are searching for help with fibromyalgia and chronic pain. Here's what you can expect in this episode. I'll take you on a scenic walk around Fowler Lake in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, using the outdoors as a backdrop to discuss the importance of movement and environment for those living with chronic pain. We'll explore the science behind fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and other invisible illnesses, including how these conditions are often misunderstood and underdiagnosed. I'll share some personal stories from my medical journey, discuss the overlaps with ADHD and autism, and offer evidence-based advice and encouragement for finding relief and support. This episode is a blend of personal reflection, medical education, and practical tips, all set against the celebration of our podcast's 4th anniversary. So get comfortable and join us as we celebrate 4 years of learning, growing, and supporting each other.
We talk about getting exercise or movement, and I thought I'd take you on one of my favorite walks in my hometown of Oconomowoc here. And it's walking around Fowler Lake. And it's so nice to get outside. This is being filmed in what would be called the sweet spot, in my opinion, of Wisconsin, as far as temperature-wise. And the weather is just gorgeous here. And I grew up in Wisconsin and ended up doing my medical residency in Richmond, Virginia. And enjoyed it. And when I left Wisconsin to come to Virginia, not only did they say I had an accent, but they also would often say how cold it was in Wisconsin. That was their first reaction. For those of you who aren't in the United States, or those of you out of the United States, there's a famous football team in Wisconsin called the Green Bay Packers. And the Green Bay Packers are one of the best football teams, called the Frozen Tundra, where they play, because once you get into December and January, it gets awfully cold. And I'll have to admit, it takes a really good team and high motivation to go to one of those games when it's that cold out and it's all outside. I said, I'm going to go somewhere different for my medical residency, and ended up matching in Richmond, Virginia, which I loved. I always say if I was an orphan, I would have stayed in Virginia. The temperature was beautiful. It was an hour and a half from the beach and about an hour and a half from the Shenandoah National Park, where there's incredible hiking. And if I got off on a Saturday and had some time, I would just go up, drive an hour and a half, hike for a few hours. There was beautiful waterfalls there, beautiful hiking trails. In fact, got engaged on the White Oak Canyon Trail. The climate was very warm in the summer, lasted long, but winters weren't harsh. And for many people with fibromyalgia, it's hard when the winters get really cold here in Wisconsin. One of the reasons that I do the podcast, and I was just hooking up this camera, getting ready to go for this walk with you, is talking about what this podcast is about, what this YouTube channel is about, and why I do this. And it's really to give a better understanding to a population of people that often is very much misunderstood. It's a population that often, as a recent triage nurse shared with me, who's recognized a lot of the patients that I work with are often people who fall through the cracks. These are people who have what's called invisible illnesses. They, on the outside, look okay. They don't necessarily have a broken bone. They're not paralyzed, but they often have been to many different doctors, if not dozens of doctors, sometimes 50 different doctors, just going on often for decades, going back to childhood, and often feel like they may have been medically gaslit, saying there's nothing wrong with you, it's all in the head. And taking a look here, if you can get a look at this beautiful bridge going over the lake here, and I'd get too busy on this spin here. And so these are people who I've grown a big interest in helping over these years. I look back at this group, and going into medical school, they were called hypochondriacs. And these were people historically, in many generations past, would have been called hysterical. And that was partly related to the observation that women had this more often, seemed to be affected more by their cycle. In the past, they tried to do hysterectomies to relieve the struggle. Now we understand things like endometriosis. This group of people who were often misunderstood. When I was in medical residency in the late 90s, about this thing called fibromyalgia, and about this thing that the concept called central sensitization, and I thought that was very curious. So much of medicine is the typical biomedical model, which is where you are looking at these problems as a simple solution. Going under these trees here, as we look at those problems, we think of somebody who's having a heart attack, and the blood flow is not getting to the heart. They're having chest pain, and you have to quick rescue them. Put in a catheter that has a balloon around it, open that blockage and allow blood flow to go and rescue people. We take care of diabetes, where you can help cure somebody with type 1 diabetes, where the body shuts down and you can rescue their body from dying because they can't get glucose into their cells for energy purposes. That's what we were trained on. We were trained on the biomedical acute management of these problems. We do our best with chronic medical management. Again, often that biomedical approach, which has to do with blood pressure medicines, help lower blood pressure. And to some extent, recognizing that there is a need for healthy lifestyle, but wasn't a huge emphasis, as often it's very time consuming. So just through observation, and because I work with children and adults, I get a chance to see families, and over time started just wanting to learn more about these. In medical residency, they would have this case of the week in the world of pediatrics, and this was an interesting case where you learn from. And one of the cases I presented was, he was a middle school student who was skipping school and was having these recurrent abdominal pain episodes, and he was having recurrent vomiting and skipping school because of these problems. And I kind of found it very curious, and the diagnosis of cyclical vomiting syndrome was made. This was probably around 1997. And what I found interesting is that at the time, the head of the pediatric residency program, and I do the combined training, so both in internal medicine and pediatrics, so taking care of kids and adults found this extremely interesting. And so we made the diagnosis of cyclical vomiting syndrome and recognize now that's under what it's now understood as these nociplastic pain syndromes, these chronic pain syndromes, these invisible illnesses. Also, looking even farther back from that, I remember being in my pre-medical program in my undergrad called Target MD. Across the street at the time there was Columbia Hospital, which that building no longer exists. And I did volunteer work, taking specimens to and from the lab, being able to interact with the emergency room doctors to learn more about medicine and grow an understanding of that. But anyways, I remember seeing this chronic fatigue syndrome support crew being posted there, and I didn't go to one of those, but I remember hearing at the time, was this even a real problem? Was chronic fatigue syndrome even real? And what is it? It was like, what is this thing? And I, again, was curious, right? You know, I remember going back even further in time in my interest in trying to understand health and illness and the body was in the 1980s, learning about AIDS and HIV. My grandmother, who lived on a farm, very smart, she had gotten a subscription to National Geographic. And I remember reading the information and articles they had on HIV and AIDS and these illnesses back when they were first being discovered. And I just found it interesting because it was something you could look at and understand. There were these viral components of the different viral particles, and they were hoping to try to block the pathways for reproducing these viruses. Again, it was something that you could look at and understand. And here there was this mysterious, invisible illness that people had. Didn't know what it was like. You know, the internet wasn't like it was now, where you could just research things, which again is part of why I do this podcast and I do the YouTube channel, is so that you can have good information that's evidence-based. I'm not here to sell you a supplement. I'm not here to give you a gimmick, but good, honest advice that's evidence-based, based on studies, based on what we know, trying to integrate what we learned from all the different specialties. Getting back to that patient who had cyclical vomiting syndrome, well, turns out that's under this fibromyalgia umbrella. That's part of this nociplastic pain syndromes that people have. Nociplastic pain syndromes is more of an updated term for what used to be called central sensitization syndromes. It has to do with the difference in how the central nervous system processes information, leading to different perception of the world around us. So at the core of all of these are going to be heightened pain sensitivity. So there's a pain amplification. One way I kind of like to think about this is that people who have this, their nervous system is like a amplifier that you have tuned up to a higher intensity. So if I'm playing my guitar, it's plugged into the amplifier, and if it's just me and its volume is turned very low, it's not going to produce a very high decibel. But I could take the same strumming pattern that I have and have it extremely amplified. The decibels coming from that can be extremely loud. So that's where somebody can have just extreme sensitivity to light touch. That's called allodynia. Things that aren't supposed to be causing harm cause the perception of harm going on. And then you also have people who have an injury, but it's not a severe injury, not likely to cause major problem, but then you have hyperalgesia. That means that people who have this will report pain out of proportion to the tissue damage. Now, what put this on the map, what made this real, what evidence that made this acknowledgement, made this medical community recognize that this was legitimate, was when functional MRIs became widely used, okay? So functional MRIs, they are tools that you can use to look at blood flow in parts of the brain, looking at brain activity. And what they found was that those who had fibromyalgia compared to those who didn't, when they received a painful stimulus, which was pressure across the thumbnail at a graded level, which meant gradually increasing the amount of pressure across the thumbnail, reported pain at about half the amount of pressure as those without fibromyalgia. But then when they looked at activity within the brain, they discovered that those with fibromyalgia had the same part of the brain activated as those without. So the experience of distress as perceived within our brain was the same. So that's one part of these nociplastic pain syndrome, is general pain. Now, just so you know, there can be varying degrees of distress in each of these 4 criteria. So one of them is pain. The other 3 include fatigue, which is often quite profound. There's also insomnia, and there's also brain fog or cognitive difficulties. So we'll talk more about each of these. So you'll have fatigue, which is often a very different type of fatigue. It's not necessarily a fatigue with the shortness of breath, but it's often that not having the ability to continue and persist with the task being run down. I've done many episodes on this, and just recently in this late spring of 2025, the whole series on chronic fatigue syndrome, which looked at a study from the NIH and also through studies done by Dr. Joel Young, trying to understand the differences. And what they found was, in a summary, was that there was no difference in the muscles or no difference in the wiring to the muscles from the brain and spinal cord. There was a difference in how the brain and brain activity, underactive activity in parts of the brain with those with chronic fatigue syndrome compared to those who did not have chronic fatigue syndrome. We also found differences in autonomic nervous system function. There's its major fatigue aspect, and often there's a huge part of insomnia, which has to deal with different disrupted sleep. There's different brain patterns, intrusions within the deep sleep, preventing people from getting into that restorative sleep. Often higher rates of restless leg, sleep apnea. Love this beautiful site here. Also, there were higher rates of brain fog, which is difficulty with concentrating, focus, staying on task. And as more and more studies are showing, there's high co-occurrence of ADHD in those who have these nociplastic pain syndrome. Joel Young has shared this spring that in his research that he's done, showing 70 to 80% of those with chronic fatigue syndrome had co-occurring ADHD, which is often missed, standard testing, which is very important to be aware of and recognize. I've recognized this co-occurrence of these ADHD in these syndromes as well. And treating that has been shown to be helpful in many ways. Helps with fatigue, it can help with sleep, it can help with brain fog, and it can also help with pain. And it allows often somebody to persist with doing exercise that they might have given up on earlier. It can help activate that underactive part of the brain when they're saying, my brain says I can't do it anymore, but the muscles say we could. So they're brain fog, fatigue, insomnia, and chronic pain. multiple areas of the body. Now, what's the difference between like a fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, which in my opinion are about the same, and something like a migraine, for example? So when I look at what are the differences, is that I think of fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue as those are 5-alarm fires. In fact, if you look at how fibromyalgia is diagnosed, you will have these 5-alarm fires, which means you have 5 different regions in your body that are activated. So when you look at that, you'll have pain in the midsection, so the spine and jaw. You'll have pain. You also have pain in the right upper extremity, left upper extremity, right and left lower extremity. And you can have central pains where there's abdominal and spine, where there's problems that go along with that. So when you look at something like a migraine, it's often a regional pain. It's just in the head. You think of irritable bowel syndrome, functional abdominal pain syndromes. Those are in one region. Now, it's not uncommon for somebody to have multiple problems. We have migraines and IBS, and may have a chronic back pain, may also have leg pain. And I think fibromyalgia is often underdiagnosed because they don't want to be perceived as this hypochondriac complaining that they hurt everywhere. So they'll just complain of the areas that hurt the most. And often they've been maybe told that by doctor visits. You can't complain of all these areas. We can only pick one area that we can complain about. But these often co-occur, and that's part of how I got interested in these areas and recognizing how this often runs in families, often taking care of it. You might have an individual who had a migraine, and then their daughter comes in with chronic back pain. Their sibling may have chronic fatigue. Grandma might have had general body arthritis, which was what they often might have called it back in the day when a 50-year-old woman has pain everywhere in the body, not necessarily the wear and tear rheumatoid arthritis. And so you start to recognize these patterns that run in families and recognize that these are all part of this nociplastic pain umbrella. And it turns out that these are problems that have overlapping treatments. Now, there are specific ways that we can treat migraines with specific mechanisms that target it, and there's specific medicines that target irritable bowel syndrome and the GI. But the biopsychosocial, spiritual, environmental understanding makes a big difference. So when you're approaching these, what helps in one area will help in the other area. Not only is ADHD commonly occurring in those who have fibromyalgia and these chronic pain syndromes, but those who have fibromyalgia, chronic pain syndrome, are more likely to have an autistic style brain and nervous system, which I look at in a neutral way has a difference in how the brain and nervous system process the environment around them. And often when we're talking about these, we sometimes may be thinking of them as a separate thing. I was trained to understand the autism as a problem more to do with language and communication differences, often thought of IQ problems with struggling in school, not trying to get help with those. And we're going to be coming up on what I think is one of the most beautiful parts of this walk. And we'll have a chance to pause and take a look at this as we come up here. But recognizing that there's more than just communication differences, but there is also differences in the sensory system. And that's why if you look through the podcast episodes, I have gotten a chance to learn so much about these overlapping syndromes and share this information with others, but especially get an opportunity to interview guests who are experts in the area of autism and ADHD, and the same ways to help understand autism and ADHD and these neurodivergent brain styles. Some of those same strategies are going to help people have less of an issue with their fibromyalgia, have less flare-ups. Now, here's a little waterfall. There's bigger places in the world, but what a peaceful day here it is you get a chance to overlook and see such beautiful scenery going on a walk like this. And I bet for many of you who are living with fibromyalgia feel so much better when you're in the right environment, meaning you're in a place where the weather is what makes your fibromyalgia less distressed. And for more of my patients living in Wisconsin here, where the winters are cold and the summers are very warm and at times hot, generally do better with warmer temperatures and struggle in the winter. So it's this recognition like, wow, what can I do to help me feel better? And that's one of those going for these walks. This is actually a really neat park in here that's looking across at Lac La Belle. Here's walking down this path into this area where we have a waterfall. Watch your steps here. It's a nice path if you wanted to just sit here and read a book, sit down. What a beautiful place. This all got done. I think most of it got finished in the fall, but then they put the landscaping in this year. And this used to be just this empty lot that the community came together and raised money to support the lot. And here is kind of a neat little boat place where you have store boats. Now you can take your kayak in and out, canoes in and out here. And then we're looking over here, walking over closer to the waterfall and get a chance to understand, get a chance to check this out. Again, there's that beautiful bridge in the background. And then here is another waterfall, kind of relaxing. It's about the best we get in Wisconsin with waterfalls here. And I hope that you're enjoying this walk with me as we are learning more about fibromyalgia. And I hope to get a chance to see some of you at the International ADHD Conference put on by CHAD. That's the Organization Children and Adults with ADHD. That's going to be in Kansas City, Missouri, coming up this November. Let's go up this here, and I will hike up this hill and take a look at the people fishing, overlooking here. Some beautiful kayaking. What do you guys like to do when you're trying to survive with kayaks? I think for many people who I work with who look historically what's helped them the most, it's often getting outside.
Thank you so much for joining me on this special 4th anniversary episode. I hope you enjoyed our walk, the stories, and the insights I shared today. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast platform or watching on YouTube, I'm grateful to have you as part of this community. If you found this episode helpful, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with someone who might benefit. Don't forget, you can find the link to the YouTube video in the show notes if you'd like to watch or share the visual version. As we continue to grow and reach more people, your support means the world to me. Remember, you're not alone on this journey with fibromyalgia or chronic pain. There's a whole community here to support you. Thanks again for being here for these 4 amazing years. Here's to many more episodes of learning, growing, and supporting each other. Take care, and I'll see you next time.